I spent 11 years in America, working double shifts, saving every dollar, dreaming of the day I could finally come home for good. When we landed in India, my whole family was waiting with flowers and tears, hugging us like we were heroes. For a few days, it felt like a dream come true. But slowly, I started noticing something underneath all that warmth, something nobody said out loud. One person in my family had already decided exactly how my savings should be spent, and it had nothing to do with love. I never imagined that coming home after so many years would make me question everything I believed about family. For 11 years I had been dreaming about this moment, and now that it was finally here, something inside me felt heavier than I expected, not lighter. It started with a phone call from my sister-in-law, 3 days before we landed in Hyderabad. She called just to say that everyone was so excited, that the whole street already knew we were coming back for good, that people kept asking her what date exactly. I remember laughing with my wife Aditi about it, saying maybe we are becoming famous in our own colony. We didn't think much of it then. We were too busy packing 11 years of our life into 6 suitcases, trying to decide which memories were worth carrying across an ocean and which ones we would just leave behind in a small apartment in New Jersey. My name is Nikhil Sharma. I am 36 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I was living in Edison, New Jersey, working as a systems analyst for a mid-sized insurance company. Aditi worked as a billing coordinator at a hospital not far from our apartment. We were what people back home would call a normal working couple. Nothing special, nothing extraordinary. We didn't own a big house. We didn't drive fancy cars. What we had was something simpler and, in its own way, harder to build. 11 years of discipline. When we first moved to the United States, I was 25, fresh out of a company-sponsored transfer, and Aditi joined me 2 years later after we got married. Neither of us came from money. My father worked in a government office his whole life, the kind of job that gives you respect in the neighborhood but not much in the bank account. Aditi's family ran a small stationery shop near the bus stand in our town. So when we landed in America, we both understood, without needing to say it out loud, that nobody was going to hand us anything. Whatever we built, we would have to build with our own hands. Slowly, carefully, one paycheck at a time. Those first years were not easy. I remember working double shifts during tax season just to cover extra expenses, coming home so tired that I would fall asleep still wearing my work clothes. Aditi took on weekend shifts at the hospital whenever they needed coverage, even though it meant we barely saw each other some weeks. We didn't go on vacations like our neighbors did. We didn't buy new furniture when the old furniture started looking worn out. Our first television was something we found secondhand from a family that was moving back to India. For years, our idea of a treat was ordering biryani on a Friday night instead of cooking. People who have never lived far from home sometimes don't understand what it costs to save money the way we did. It's not just about spending less. It's about saying no to things again and again, year after year, even when you're tired of saying no. It's about watching your friends upgrade their cars while you keep driving the same old sedan with the check engine light that never quite goes away. It's about missing your cousin's wedding because the flight tickets alone would have eaten into 3 months of savings, and then feeling that small ache every time someone shows you photographs from that day. But we kept telling ourselves it was temporary. We kept telling ourselves that one day we would go back, and all of this sacrifice would turn into something solid, something we could touch, something we could finally rest inside. Slowly, it did. By our 9th year in the United States, we had managed to save enough that we started seriously talking about what life would look like once we returned. We wanted to buy a proper house, something with enough space for a small garden, maybe 2 floors, in a good locality close to both our families. We wanted to be able to help my parents with their medical expenses without worrying every single month. We wanted, more than anything, to stop living between 2 time zones, always calculating what time it was in India before we called, always feeling like we were missing birthdays and festivals and small ordinary moments that you can never really get back. 2 years ago, we made the final decision. We would return once I completed 11 years, because that was when a certain retirement benefit from my company would fully vest, and it made financial sense to wait that little bit longer. Aditi agreed immediately. She had been homesick for years, though she rarely said it directly. I would catch her sometimes on video calls with her mother, her voice changing, becoming softer, almost like a different person. The person she was before America made her more careful, more guarded. So when the day finally came, when we boarded that flight with 6 suitcases and a lifetime of memories packed into every corner of our hearts, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like I could finally breathe out. The moment we walked out of the airport in Hyderabad, the heat hit us first. That thick, familiar heat that no amount of years abroad can make you forget. Then came the noise, the traffic, the smell of frying food from a nearby stall. And then, almost like a wave, came the people. My parents were there, of course. My mother crying before I even reached her, holding my face in her hands like she was checking to make sure I was really real and not just another video call. My father stood a little behind her, trying to look composed, but I could see his eyes were wet too. What surprised me was how many other people had come. Aunts I hadn't spoken to directly in years. Cousins who used to reply to my messages with just a thumbs up emoji, now standing there with garlands of flowers, insisting on taking photographs. Neighbors from our old street, people I barely remembered, telling me how proud they were, how they used to tell their own children to work hard like Nikhil, to go abroad and make something of themselves like we did. For the first few days, it felt like a dream. Every evening there was a different house we were invited to. Someone's mother had cooked a special dinner just for us. Someone's father wanted to hear stories about America, about the snow, about the big supermarkets, about how different life was there compared to here. Aditi and I would come home late every night, exhausted but genuinely happy, lying in bed and talking about how wonderful it felt to be surrounded by so much love after so many years of missing exactly this. It was during one of these gatherings, maybe 4 or 5 days after we arrived, that I first properly spoke with my brother-in-law, Aditi's older sister's husband. His name is Rakesh. Over the years, our relationship had always been polite but distant, the kind of relationship where you greet each other warmly at weddings and then don't think about each other again until the next wedding. We had never had a real conversation, just the two of us. At family functions, we would exchange a few words about cricket or traffic, and that was usually the extent of it. That evening, though, he came and sat right next to me on the veranda, away from the noise of the other relatives, and asked me how I was adjusting to being back. He asked genuine questions about jet lag, about whether Aditi and I had started house hunting yet, about how strange it must feel after so many years. He seemed different from how I remembered him, warmer, more interested, like he genuinely wanted to know how we were doing. I remember feeling touched by it. I remember thinking, maybe this is what happens when you come back after a long time away. Maybe people realize how much they missed you, and it brings out a side of them you never really got to see before. I had no idea, sitting there on that veranda with the sound of my nieces laughing somewhere in the garden and the smell of jasmine in the air, that this same warmth would become the beginning of the hardest decision I would ever have to make. I woke up on our 6th day back with a strange kind of tiredness, the kind that doesn't come from jet lag anymore, but from something else, something harder to name. Aditi was already awake, sitting by the window of my parents' guest room, scrolling through her phone with a look on her face I hadn't seen in a long time. Rakesh called my sister again last night, she said, not looking up. 3rd time this week. I didn't think much of it at first. Family members call each other all the time in India, especially when there's something to celebrate, and our return counted as something worth celebrating. But Aditi had this way of noticing patterns before I did. It was one of the things I loved about her, though it could also be exhausting when she was right and I didn't want her to be. He keeps asking questions, she continued, about how much we saved, about whether it's true that people in America can save so much in a few years. My sister told him some things, I think, small things, but he keeps asking for more. I told her she was probably overthinking it. Rakesh had always been a talkative man, curious about everything, and it wasn't unusual for people back home to be curious about life in America. Everyone wanted to know the same things: how much rent costs, whether it's true that a gallon of milk costs more than a gallon of petrol, whether the snow really comes up to your knees in winter. I had answered these questions 100 times over the years, at every wedding, every festival call, every visit. It didn't feel strange to me yet, but over the next few days I started noticing it myself. Rakesh began coming to my parents' house almost every single day. Sometimes he brought fruit, sometimes sweets from a shop nearby, always with some small reason, some small excuse. He would sit with my father for a while, talk about local politics or the price of vegetables, and then, almost without fail, he would find a way to sit next to me and steer the conversation toward America. How was the job market there? Whether I thought the company I worked for was doing well, whether it was really possible, working an ordinary job to save the kind of money people whispered about. I answered honestly, the way I always did. I told him it wasn't magic, that it was years of overtime, years of not spending on things other people spent on, years of watching every rupee, or every dollar, I should say. I told him that people back home imagined life in America as some kind of endless money machine, but the truth was much more ordinary. You worked hard, you saved carefully, and slowly, over many years, something accumulated. He nodded along every time, seeming to understand, seeming genuinely impressed by the discipline it required. And I'll admit, it felt good to be appreciated that way. After years of Aditi and I quietly making sacrifices that nobody back home ever really saw, it felt good to have someone finally acknowledge how difficult it had actually been. It was on the 9th day that he first mentioned the shed. We were sitting on the veranda again, in the evening, the same spot where we'd had our first real conversation. He had a small notebook with him, the kind of cheap ruled notebook you buy from any stationery shop, and he opened it almost shyly, like he was embarrassed to be showing me something he had clearly worked on for a long time. "I want your opinion on something," he said. "Just your opinion, nothing more." He explained that he owned a piece of land on the outskirts of town, inherited from his father, about half an acre, currently just sitting empty, growing weeds. For years he had been thinking about what to do with it. Recently, he said, he had noticed that small businesses in the area, tailors, mechanics, a man who repaired mobile phones, were all struggling to find affordable spaces to rent. His idea was to build a shed, a proper commercial structure, divided into small units, and rent them out. He had done real calculations. He showed me the numbers, written carefully in pencil, how much it would cost to build, how much he expected to earn in rent once it was fully occupied, how many years it would take to recover the investment. I have to admit, the plan wasn't foolish. There was real thought behind it. He wasn't asking me to fund some fantasy. "The land is mine already," he said. "That is my contribution. What I need is someone who can help with the construction cost." I asked him how much that would be, more out of curiosity than anything else. He told me a number, and it was significant, though not impossible. Then he said something that made the conversation shift entirely. "I was thinking, since you have been working in America for so many years, maybe you could take on most of the construction cost. 80%, let's say. I bring the land, you bring the capital. We split whatever the shed earns each month." I sat there for a moment, not entirely sure how to respond. It wasn't the request itself that surprised me. Family members ask each other for help all the time, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of what family means. What surprised me was the framing. In his mind, it seemed this was already a fair deal, already decided, already something I should naturally agree to, simply because I had spent over a decade working abroad and he assumed, correctly or not, that this made me wealthy in a way that made 80% seem reasonable. I told him I would think about it. He smiled, patted my shoulder, and said there was no rush. "Take your time. Family should never feel pressured." But something in the way he said it made me feel like there already was pressure, quiet and invisible, the kind that doesn't announce itself directly. That night, I told Aditi about the conversation. She listened carefully, not interrupting, the way she always does when she's turning something over in her mind before speaking. 80%, she repeated slowly. "And what happens if the shed doesn't get tenants? What happens if it takes longer than he thinks to fill those units?" I didn't have an answer. I hadn't thought about it that way. I had been so focused on how touched I felt that he wanted to include me in something, that I hadn't stopped to consider the actual risk sitting underneath his careful pencil calculations. Over the next several days, I started paying closer attention to conversations happening around me, the ones I wasn't necessarily meant to be part of. My mother mentioned, almost in passing, that a distant cousin needed help paying for his daughter's engagement ceremony. My father mentioned that a neighbor's son was struggling to find a good match for marriage because the family couldn't offer much of a dowry. And wasn't it a shame? Wasn't it something a helpful relative could quietly assist with? Aditi's sister mentioned that Rakesh's own business, a small hardware shop he ran, had been slower than usual this year, though she said it lightly, like it wasn't anything serious. None of these conversations were directed at me. Nobody asked me for anything directly, not yet. But I started to notice how often money came up, how often difficulty came up, how often these conversations happened when I was sitting close enough to hear them. I began to feel something I wasn't proud of, a kind of suspicion creeping into moments that used to feel purely warm. When my mother hugged me tightly at dinner and said how blessed she felt to have a son like me, I found myself wondering just for a second whether that blessing was entirely about love or partly about what that love might now provide. I hated feeling that way. I hated that 11 years of hard work had made me this cautious, this guarded, even toward my own family. Aditi felt it too, though she processed it differently than I did. She grew quieter during family gatherings, more careful with her words, watching more than talking. One night, after we had gone to another dinner at her sister's house, she sat on the edge of our bed and said something that stayed with me for a long time. "I'm scared," she said, "that we spent 11 years building something, only to come home and immediately be treated like a bank account instead of like family." I didn't know what to say to her, because somewhere inside me, quietly, I was starting to feel exactly the same fear, and I didn't yet know how to face it. The following week, Rakesh brought up the shed again, this time more directly. We were at my parents' house for Sunday lunch, and after the meal, when most of the family had scattered to different rooms for their afternoon rest, he asked if I could step outside with him for a few minutes. He wanted to show me something on his phone, photographs of the land, angles he had taken from different sides, even a rough sketch someone had drawn for him of how the units could be divided. "I spoke to a contractor," he said. "He can start within a month if we're ready. Prices for cement and steel keep going up every year, so waiting is not good for us." I noticed the word he used. Us. Not him, not his plan, but us. As if I had already agreed. As if the decision had somehow been made without my saying yes to anything. I told him I still needed time, that Aditi and I hadn't finished discussing our own plans yet, that we still hadn't even decided which house we wanted to buy for ourselves. His face changed slightly, just for a moment, something between disappointment and confusion. "But you already have a house in America," he said. "This is different. This is here, with family, something that will benefit everyone, including your own parents eventually, since I would obviously make sure they never had to worry about anything." That last part struck me. He was connecting the shed somehow, to my parents' well-being, as if refusing him meant I was choosing not to care for them. I understood in that moment that this wasn't simply a business proposal anymore. It had become something tangled up with loyalty, with duty, with the unspoken rules of what a good son and a good brother-in-law was supposed to do. That evening, I called my old friend Suresh, someone I had grown up with, who had stayed in India his whole life and worked as an accountant in Hyderabad. I trusted his judgment because he wasn't emotionally involved in any of this, and he had seen enough family businesses over the years, both the ones that worked and the ones that didn't. I explained everything to him, the shed, the 80%, the way Rakesh had connected it to my parents' welfare. Suresh was quiet for a moment before responding. "Nikhil, listen to me carefully," he said. "I'm not saying Rakesh is a bad man. Maybe his plan is even a good one on paper, but you need to ask yourself something. If this shed does well, who benefits the most? And if it fails, who loses the most?" I told him what Rakesh had proposed, that we would split the profits. "Split the profits, yes," Suresh said. "But who owns 80% of the construction? If something goes wrong, if tenants don't come, if there's a dispute later about the land itself, whose name is actually on the property? Is it in both your names? Or does he remain the sole owner of the land while you simply become the person who paid for most of the building sitting on top of it?" That question hit me harder than I expected, because I realized I hadn't asked it. I had been so focused on the emotional side of things, on family duty, on not wanting to disappoint anyone, that I hadn't stopped to think through the actual structure of what was being proposed. If the land remained solely in Rakesh's name, and I paid for 80% of the construction, what protection did I actually have? What would happen years from now if there was a disagreement? If he decided things should be divided differently? If his own children one day questioned why an outsider, meaning me, held any claim to what they considered their father's property? I brought this up with Aditi that night, and for the first time since we'd returned, I saw real worry on her face, not just discomfort, but genuine worry. "Nikhil, I don't want this to become something that damages our marriage or your relationship with my sister," she said. "But I also don't want us to hand over everything we worked for, just because we're scared of looking selfish." The next few days were difficult in a quiet, internal way that nobody around us could probably see from the outside. We continued attending family functions, continued smiling in photographs, continued eating dinners at various relatives' houses. But underneath all of it, Aditi and I were having a different kind of conversation, late at night, in whispers, trying to figure out where the line was between helping family and losing ourselves in the process. I started paying attention to smaller things I had ignored before. I noticed that Rakesh's shop, The hardware business Aditi's sister had mentioned in passing seemed to be struggling more than he let on. When we visited it one afternoon, there were fewer customers than I expected, and some of the shelves looked less stocked than they probably should have been for a business that was supposedly doing fine. I also noticed that he had, at some point in the last year, taken a loan from a local moneylender, something my father-in-law mentioned quietly to my father one evening, thinking I wasn't listening closely. This changed how I understood the shed proposal. It wasn't simply an investment opportunity he wanted to share with family out of generosity. It was, at least partly, a way for him to solve his own financial pressure, using my savings as the solution, while presenting it as a partnership between equals. I didn't think he was a bad person for this. I understood, in a strange way, why he might feel entitled to ask. From where he stood, I had spent 11 years abroad, in a country everyone imagined as full of endless opportunity, and now I had returned with enough money to buy a house outright. To him, and probably to others in the family, the difference between us must have looked enormous, unfair even, like I had access to some kind of wealth that came easily, while he had spent all those years struggling in the same town, watching prices rise, watching his own business become harder to sustain. But understanding his position didn't mean I had to agree to his plan, especially not a plan that put almost all the financial risk on me while leaving him fully protected as the sole owner of the underlying asset. I decided to speak with him directly, honestly, the way I would have wanted someone to speak with me if our positions were reversed. I asked him to meet me alone, without other family members around, at a small tea stall near his shop, a place we used to go to sometimes as young men before I left for America. I told him I had thought carefully about his proposal, and that I appreciated him trusting me enough to include me in something so important to him. Then I explained, as gently as I could, that I wasn't comfortable investing 80% of the construction cost, while the land remained solely in his name, with no legal protection for what I contributed. I told him that if he was open to it, we could explore a different structure, something where ownership was shared proportionally, formalized properly with legal documents, so that both of us, and eventually both of our children, would be protected no matter what happened in the future. His reaction wasn't anger, not exactly, but I could see disappointment settle into his face, the kind of disappointment that comes when someone realizes a plan they had already built up in their mind isn't going to unfold the way they imagined. I thought family didn't need documents, he said quietly. I thought family trusted each other. I told him that trust and protection weren't opposites, that having things written down properly wasn't about distrust. It was about making sure nobody, years from now, had reason to feel resentful or cheated, including his own children, who might one day look at the shed and wonder why part of what should have been their inheritance was tied up with someone outside the immediate family. He didn't agree right away. He said he needed time to think, that maybe his own brother could help with the investment instead, someone who wouldn't ask so many questions. I left that conversation feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because I had finally said what needed to be said, instead of letting silent pressure build until I felt trapped into agreeing to something I would regret. Sadness because I understood that this conversation had probably changed something in our relationship, something that might never quite go back to how it was during those first warm days after we returned, when everything still felt simple, and everyone still felt happy to have us home. That night, I told Aditi everything, word for word, the way the conversation had gone, the disappointment in his face, the mention of documents, the comment about trust. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she reached over and took my hand. "You did the right thing," she said, "even if it doesn't feel like it right now." I wanted to believe her completely, but somewhere underneath that reassurance, I could still feel the weight of everything that had happened in just those few weeks since we landed, the warmth that had slowly revealed layers I hadn't expected, and the uncomfortable realization that coming home, after everything we had sacrificed to make it possible, would require a different kind of strength than the one that had gotten us through 11 years abroad. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the family, subtle at first, then harder to ignore. Rakesh stopped coming by every day. When we did see him at gatherings, he was polite, even friendly on the surface. But something had cooled between us, something that everyone in the family seemed to sense without anyone actually explaining what had happened. My mother noticed it first. One afternoon, while we were sorting through old photographs in her cupboard, she asked me quietly if something had happened between me and Rakesh. I hesitated, not wanting to create tension between families. not wanting her to feel caught in the middle of something. But eventually I told her a simplified version, that Rakesh had proposed a business partnership, that I had asked for proper documentation before committing my savings, and that he had seemed to take it personally. My mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I hadn't expected. Your father and I always worried this might happen. Not because Rakesh is a bad man, but because people forget how hard it was for you and Aditi, living in a small apartment, working double shifts, missing weddings and funerals. They only see what you have now, not what it cost you to get here. Her words settled something in me that I hadn't realized needed settling. For weeks, I had been quietly carrying guilt, wondering if I was being selfish, wondering if 11 years abroad had changed me into someone who valued money over family. Hearing my own mother acknowledge the sacrifice, without me having to explain or defend it, felt like a kind of permission I didn't know I needed. Around the same time, a different kind of request came from another direction entirely, one that tested us in a completely different way. My father's younger brother, my uncle Vinod, approached me one evening, not about a business plan, but about his son's education. His son, my cousin, had been accepted into a private engineering college, a good one, but the fees were more than the family could comfortably manage. Uncle Vinod didn't ask for 80% of anything. He didn't come with a notebook full of calculations or talk about partnerships. He simply explained the situation honestly, told me exactly how much he had already saved, and asked if we could help cover the difference, whatever amount that turned out to be. The contrast between these two situations taught me something important. It wasn't that helping family was wrong. It wasn't that every request deserved suspicion. It was that the way a request was made, the honesty behind it, the willingness to be transparent about what was actually needed and why, made all the difference between something that felt like genuine family support and something that felt like being quietly maneuvered into a corner. Aditi and I discussed it that night, and we agreed almost immediately. We would help with my cousin's education, not as an investment expecting returns, but as a gift, freely given, the kind of help we could offer without feeling like we were being used. It wasn't a huge amount, certainly nothing close to what Rakesh had originally proposed, but it felt right in a way the shed proposal never had. Word of this spread through the family quickly, the way these things always do. Some relatives seemed to view it as proof that we were, in fact, willing to help when asked properly. Others, I suspect, felt a quiet frustration that we had said no to Rakesh, but yes to Uncle Vinod, without fully understanding the difference between the two situations. About a month after our initial conversation at the tea stall, Rakesh came to my parents' house again, this time without his notebook, without his careful calculations. He asked to speak with me privately, and we sat once more on that same veranda where everything had started. He told me he had thought a lot about what I said, that his own brother-in-law, someone from his wife's side of the family, had actually agreed to help him with a smaller version of the shed project, one he could manage on his own, with a bank loan and a more modest scope. He said it without bitterness, though I could still hear a trace of disappointment underneath his words. Maybe you were right, he said eventually. Maybe I was thinking of you as a solution, instead of thinking of you as family first. It wasn't a dramatic apology. It wasn't the kind of moment you might expect from a film, with tears and long embraces. It was just an honest admission, quiet and imperfect, the way most real conversations between two adult men tend to be. I told him I hoped his smaller project worked out, and I meant it. I didn't wish him failure. I simply hadn't wanted to risk everything we had built on a plan that left me financially exposed while leaving him fully protected. Over the following months, as Aditi and I settled into our new life back in India, we started house hunting seriously, finally focusing on what we had actually returned home to build. We found a modest but comfortable house in a good neighborhood, not extravagant, but exactly what we had pictured during all those years of saving. A small garden where my mother could grow her vegetables, enough space for family to visit without feeling cramped, and enough distance from both our extended families that we could maintain healthy boundaries while still staying close. Slowly, the tension that had built up during those first difficult weeks began to soften, not because every problem disappeared, but because we had established something important, both to ourselves and to the people around us. We had shown that we could love our family deeply, support them generously, and still protect what we had spent over a decade building. We learned that these two things, generosity and boundaries, weren't opposites. They could exist together, as long as we were honest and clear about which was which. Rakesh's smaller shed project, the one he built without our involvement, eventually got off the ground about 8 months later. It wasn't the grand vision he had originally described to me, but it was something real, built on a scale he could actually manage himself. When it was finished, he invited the whole family to a small celebration. And standing there, watching him proudly show relatives around the modest structure he had built with his own resources, I felt something unexpected. I felt genuinely happy for him, without any of the tension or suspicion that had colored our earlier interactions. Looking back now, almost 2 years after we returned from America, I understand things I couldn't have understood back then, sitting in that airport arrival hall, surrounded by garlands and hugs and tears of joy. I understand that coming home doesn't erase the years you spent away. It doesn't erase the sacrifices, the missed weddings, the lonely nights working overtime while your friends were out celebrating festivals without you. Those years shape you permanently, whether people around you recognize it or not. I also understand that not every request from family comes from selfishness, and not every warm welcome comes with hidden strings attached. Most of my family, I came to realize, genuinely missed us and genuinely wanted us close again. It was only a smaller number of situations, a handful of moments really, where good intentions became tangled up with financial pressure and unspoken expectations. Learning to tell the difference, learning when to say yes freely and when to pause and ask harder questions, became one of the most important skills I developed after returning home. More important in some ways than anything I had learned during those 11 years abroad. Aditi and I still send money to family sometimes, still help when we genuinely can, still show up for weddings and birthdays and every festival we can manage. But we do it now with clearer eyes, understanding our own limits, understanding that saying no to one request doesn't make us bad people, and that protecting what we built doesn't make us any less loving toward the people who raised us and welcomed us home. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I still think about that first week back, about how easy it would have been to simply agree to everything, to hand over our savings without asking a single hard question, just to avoid the discomfort of disappointing people we loved. I think about how different our lives might look now if we had, how much harder it might have been to recover from a decision made purely out of guilt rather than genuine understanding. What I learned, in the end, is that love for family and responsibility toward your own future aren't enemies. They can live side by side, as long as you're willing to have uncomfortable conversations when they're needed, and as long as you're honest, both with the people around you and with yourself, about what you can truly afford to give.